Well, it's Wednesday, so we are in Romans chapter 13. As you recall, we are in a section that goes from chapter 12 through chapter 15, I'd say about midway through chapter 15, that's talking about our reaction, our response to the justification, the salvation that's been provided to us. This is an area of service, talking about our service to the Lord, our response to Him. Again, some would confuse sometimes salvation with sanctification. And when those things get confused, oftentimes you end up with a works-based sort of salvation or a lordship-flavored salvation where you have to do certain things to either become saved or to prove you're saved. And the Bible keeps those things apart. They're related. I think they're connected. But they are separate, and that's what we're talking about here is our response to salvation or our sanctification. The question that Romans 13 is answering is how does humility, remember at the end of chapter 12, we looked at a call to service, love, and humility. How does this humility then work out in the very practicalities of life with regard to things like government, for example? So in chapter 13, verses 1 through 7, it talks about government and God's sovereignty with regard to government. Remember, chapter 9 through 11 discuss God's sovereignty and salvation. This is applying that sovereignty to our relationship with the government. And then 8 to 14 looks at how do we live in light of the Lord's coming? How do we live in anticipation of His return? So those are the two big sections in this chapter. Let's take a look at verses 1 through 7, God's sovereignty in government. Paul's very blunt here. Remember, this is not a government that has been friendly to Christianity by and large at this point. Although this early, I think it's mostly local persecutions, not empire-wide. Just some background in the book of Romans in AD 49, the Emperor Claudius responding to unrest, riots that were going on in Rome over a figure that Suetonius tells us, ancient Roman historian, he calls the riots were over Christus, which is largely understood to be riots among Jews in disagreeing over whether Jesus was the Messiah or not. So this is the time of the Pax Romana. Peace within the empire is the primary concern of the emperor. So he responded by kicking out the Jews from Rome. That's how Aquila and Priscilla, we'll talk about them I think later, ends up in Corinth with Paul. So with that background, Paul says, let every person be subject to the governing authorities, for there is no authority except God, and those that exist have been instituted by God. So Paul is saying to submit to the governing authorities because God is sovereign. God has put them into place. God has installed them in what, according to His plan and His purpose. But that's not all Paul says. So here in the United States, we have a tradition. Our government was, our country was born out of a distrust for government. So it's hard for Americans, particularly, to submit to government, to have that attitude. But it says more about government. In verse 3, it says that governing authorities that are instituted by God are not a terror to good behavior. I think that's important to keep in mind, that such governing authorities that we are to submit to are not a terror to good behavior. In verse 3, it also says that the government that God puts in place approves and commends those who do good. I'm not saying that God only puts good government in place. I think I maybe misstated that. But when Paul says to submit to governing authorities, he has a certain quality of governing authority in mind. I think God puts all governing authorities in place. So, verse 3, they're not a terror to those who behave well. Government approves and commends those who do good. Verse 4 says that a government that's worth submitting to, that we ought to submit to, rules for the general good of all. Verse 4, it says it punishes wrongdoers. So it doesn't reward them, it doesn't let them off the hook. It punishes wrongdoers. And verse 5 says it does not cause one to violate their conscience. So a good government to submit to is one that does not cause you to violate your conscience. So before I go on, let me say what happens when a government doesn't meet these requirements, doesn't meet these criteria of a government that is worth submitting to. Let me first turn to 1 Timothy 2, 1 and 2. Again, Paul is writing this later than the book of Romans. Nero is on the throne in Rome. He says, first of all, then I urge that supplications, prayers, intercessions, and thanksgiving be made for all people. And then he specifies what he means by all people. For kings and all who are in high positions, that we may lead a peaceful, quiet, godly, and dignified life in every way. So basically, Paul is saying to pray that the governing authorities leave us alone to pursue holiness. When he says all governing authorities for all kings and all who are in high places, I don't think he means this exhaustively, that we don't need to sit down with a list of our elected representatives or government representatives at all levels of government. It would be an endless list and an unending prayer. I think what he's talking about is not so much prayer without exception when he says all, but prayers without distinction. No matter what political party they're in, no matter what level of government they are in, we're to pray for all the government authorities without exception. So let me say that first. But alternatively, if you find yourself in a situation where the government is not doing these things and they're calling you to submit, let me say that there is always a choice. There's always a choice to be made. Your choice can't be taken away from you. What you don't have consequence over or what you don't have control over is the consequences of your choice. So we could be talking about a citizen in a land, citizen of a country. Could also be talking about an employee relationship where your employer is putting in place policies or procedures that are not just things you disagree with, but things that are opposed to the Bible, right? Opposed to God's will, his revealed will. A difficult situation. I spent almost 10 years in the Army myself. If you're in the armed services and you're being asked to do things, again, that are not things that you just don't agree with, but things that are unbiblical, that are ungodly. If you're being asked or forced to do that or ordered to do that, number one, there is no obligation to obey an unlawful order in the military. Number two, there is what's called a conscientious objector status in the military, where you can serve in the military, but you can object to certain aspects of it and be relieved from certain requirements. And also, finally, again, you always have a choice. You just don't always like the consequence. So if we look back over church history, we find, particularly through the English Reformation and on into the outgrowth of that, the Pilgrim movement into the United States, difficult choices were made by godly men, and they paid the price in terms of their living and in terms of their lives. So there's always a choice. You just don't always have the control over the consequence. So, chapter 13, verses 1 through 7, the big picture is God has put governing authorities into place, and we ought to be the best citizens that those governing authorities have. And if those governing authorities are contrary to God's will, then we have to make a choice. Verses 8 through 14 then talks about living in light of his coming, living in light of the Lord's coming. And again, very practical direction here, very practical guidance, starting with verses 8 to 10, which is the call to love. Love fulfills the law, is what he says here. And this is echoing the words of Jesus in Matthew 22, verse 37 and following. I'm just turning there now. I'm in the wrong chapter. Chapter 22, verse 7. Jesus is being quizzed by Pharisees and lawyers. Pharisees and teachers of the law, they gather together. They ask him, what is the greatest law? He says, this is the great and first commandment, and the second is like it. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your mind. This is the great and first commandment, and the second is like it. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. So Jesus is not saying by any means that love trumps everything, but he is saying that even in our opposition to ungodliness should be somehow characterized by love for even those who oppose us. And we see that again in John 13, Jesus' final words, among his final words to his followers, in 34 and 35, to love one another. That is his commandment, that we love one another, and that's how people will know. So we have this command to, within the fellowship, living in light of his coming, to really love one another. Verses 11 through 14 then said, time is running out, is the way we can characterize this or summarize this section. When he talks about the goal of your salvation is drawing near, he says in verse 11, besides this, you know that the time, that the hour has come for you to wake up from your sleep. For salvation is nearer now than when we first believed. The night is far gone, the day is at hand. So then let us cast off the works of darkness and put on the armor of light. Let us walk properly as in the daytime. So this is a call, again, to work out, to live out our salvation. Again, consistent with this section that Paul is in, that he is urging the readers, urging the Romans and urging us to that the consummation, the climax, the outcome of our salvation, that is the return of Jesus and the rewards that we will be getting because of our service to him, is coming. It's near, so let's get on with it. Let's be piling up reward in heaven, laying it up in heaven. Then in verse 13 he talks, let us walk, let us put on, make no provision for the flesh. Again, in this context, he's not talking about salvation, he's talking about sanctification. And we'll learn from 1 Corinthians 3, 2 Corinthians 5, that there's a time coming when we're going to be assessed for what we have done in the flesh and will be rewarded accordingly. So, in terms of application of this, what do we do today? First one is really an expression of humility before God and his sovereignty is, as much as possible, to live in submission to the government that's in place, to yield ourselves, to yield our rights to that government, and to, again, with the caveats that I spoke about, there may come a time where you have to violate the government because they're violating God's word. Again, it takes wisdom, I think, maturity, discernment, that it's not just something you disagree with, a policy or a program that you disagree with, but something that is really violating or causing you to violate God's word. But as far as possible, the clear command here is to submit to the governing authorities. Second thing to keep in mind from this chapter is that how you live today what you do, how you live, how you love each other, how you serve each other, has eternal consequence. That the darkness is dispelling, that Jesus is coming, that his return could happen at any moment, and we'll be standing before him and we'll reap the rewards for what we've done in the flesh. And so we need to get on with it. We need to get on with holy living. We need to get on with serving. We need to get on with loving and obedience, humility, so that we are doing the works that God intended us to do and laying up treasures in heaven. And then finally, make the most of your days. Use every opportunity that you have. Look for every possible time that you can use your gifts, abilities, and talents. Express love and support to other men and women in the faith especially, but also those outside. And look for opportunities to serve the Lord and honor him, glorify him, and in that way, again, lay up treasure in heaven. So God bless you in your reading today of chapter 13. I hope this gives you some guidance and direction as you head into chapter 13. And may God bless you for sticking with the Romans through Revelation reading plan. Pray that it's, again, encouraging you to be in God's Word, really edifying you, which a fancy word means build up, and then to educate you, inform you of some of the background and some of the meaning of the text itself. So God bless you, brothers and sisters. Continue in the Word.